The title of our session is Moots, Noots and Tutes. We're going to be talking to you about teaching and assessing practical skills using simulations. So I'll introduce the members of the panel, all of whom are from the Faculty of Law here at Bond University. So we have, starting on the left, Tanya Atwill. Tanya is an academic in the professional legal training program within the Faculty of Law, and that means she's responsible, along with her colleague Hugh Zillman and a variety of other academics, she's responsible for providing that extra practical legal training to our law students that ensures they satisfy the practical requirements for admission as a legal practitioner. And so obviously she has a lot of experience in teaching not just the law but practical skills to our students, and she'll be sharing some of that wisdom with us this afternoon. Sat in the middle is Jackson Walkden-Brown. Jackson is an academic within the Faculty of Law who, in addition to teaching administrative law and the very popular animal law subject, plays a very important role in teaching the first semester courses to our new law students. And in that capacity, he is extremely competent and extremely popular with the students. And sat on the end of the panel is Clinical Associate Professor Libby Taylor. Libby is our Associate Dean, Student Affairs and Service Quality. She was, and was for many years, the director of the skills program within the Faculty of Law, is a very competent and experienced teacher, and is, again, very experienced in teaching practical skills to our students. So the plan for the session today, we've got just under 2 hours. So the first hour, up until about midday, we're going to be having a panel discussion around the use of simulations to teach and assess practical legal skills, and we'll be showing some example videos so you can actually see some of our students and academics at work in teaching and assessing skills. In the second hour of the session, we'll be conducting a practical exercise. We're going to have a chat about what kinds of marking criteria we might use to assess advocacy skills. We're going to show a video of a student demonstrating their advocacy skills, and we're going to have a go at assessing them ourselves, and we'll have a conversation about how that exercise went. I forgot to mention that there is, in fact, another member of the panel, Associate Professor Bobette Wolski, who was unable to be here in person today, but she has provided her contribution in the form of video. So again, we'll be playing some videos of Bobette talking while we go. Just a little bit of context. The Faculty of Law at Bond University identifies as a professional law school, which means that in addition to teaching our students the law, the doctrines, the rules, the principles, the theories, the context, we also place enormous emphasis upon preparing our law students for a professional career. So that means we try and teach the law in a way that's authentic and realistic and practical, but we also, in addition to teaching knowledge and understanding, we also put a lot of emphasis upon teaching skills and competencies while the students are learning the law. This seems to have a timer. So we actually have within our Bachelor of Laws and Juris Doctor programs an embedded an integrated skills program. So in each of the compulsory subjects that the students undertake while they're studying law, there is a component within that subject where they are taught and assessed around a particular practical legal skill. So the 4 skills that we are presently focused upon developing are legal research and analysis, legal writing and drafting, negotiation and dispute resolution, and oral communication and presentation. Now, the ways in which those students demonstrate their capacity to their ability to exercise those skills. In some cases, obviously, it's through written work, so legal writing and drafting tends to be taught and assessed using written exercises and written assessment, but skills such as negotiation and dispute resolution and oral communication and presentation can't be captured by written work. They are captured by live demonstrations by the students of those particular skills. And that's where we use simulations. So the types of live simulation exercises that we use in law include courtroom advocacy, so where the students actually, in a mock courtroom, stand up and present a legal argument as if they were a lawyer appearing in court, and we tend to refer to that as mooting or moots. We have negotiation exercises, which only recently are starting to be referred to as Noots, although that hasn't completely caught on yet. We have class debates, which is where the Tutes from the title comes into play, and we have interviews. And we're going to show demonstrations of most of those skills during the session today. So what I'm going to do in the first hour is conduct a panel discussion around 3 questions. The first question is, what do you think, why do you think it's important to teach our skills, students practical skills as well as knowledge? The second question is, how do you use live simulations in your classes to teach and assess skills? And the third question will be, what practical tips would you give someone who wants to start using simulations to teach and assess skills? And after that, we'll conduct our practical exercise. In between those questions, we'll show a couple of demonstration videos. And I think to start off with the first question, we might jump to Bobette, who's going to tell us why she thinks it's important that we actually teach skills as well as knowledge.
I did think it important first just to be clear about what learning objectives we are talking about, because I think it is important to distinguish substantive law, substantive knowledge more generally. So in the context of our law degree, that would be contract law, torts law, admin, constitutional, and several others. Generally, we talk about that as learning about, so we learn about something. And I'll give some examples in a minute which will clarify the concepts that I'm talking about. The second category of learning objectives are practical objectives, and that's usually where skills are considered to be. So that would be in the way that we had learning about for substantive objectives. We think about skills as learning how. So I'll just give a couple of really easy examples. One might learn about anatomy as a prerequisite to being a doctor. When it comes to the practical aspect, it might be learning how to do surgery. That would be the skills aspect. There is a third category. So in addition to learning how and learning about, there's a third category that I'm really passionate about including in our program, and that's it encompasses a number of things: ethics, values, and the attitudes that we want our students to have. And I think we'd all agree that, particularly for lawyers, we want to encourage in our students attitudes such as honesty and fair dealing, for just a couple of examples. I am passionate about teaching skills at law school, and I think the reason probably goes back to being partly personal. So when I did my law degree and went out to practice, I felt that I was ill-equipped to actually practice law. And just one very quick example, I didn't know at the time that lawyers in practice spend about 95% of their time actually negotiating. And I don't recall hearing the word negotiate or negotiation, I don't think once in the whole 5 years that I had been at law school. So I felt ill-equipped. And I believe that if we don't teach students skills and the ethics and values, they're never going to be complete lawyers. And if I can give some examples going back to the anatomy for doctors and perhaps to the aerodynamics for pilots, how many of us would want a doctor operating on us if they'd never actually practiced surgery? And we were in fact their first patients when it came to the practice of the skills of surgery. I think it's traditional for doctors to practice on cadavers, perhaps, so dead people basically. I certainly wouldn't want a first-time doctor to practice his or her surgery skills on me. The other instance would be this: how many of us would like to or feel comfortable sitting in a plane and actually flying if we knew that the person flying the plane had no real life experience of actually piloting, and perhaps the only time they'd practice their skills was in a simulator. Now, I've never been in a simulator, but basically, of course, it reproduces the sort of flying conditions that one might expect to have to encounter if you were a pilot. So I'm taking a long time to get to this, but the first reason is I think we should teach skills, because if we don't, then we are not sending out complete lawyers. The other reason is that substantive knowledge, so torts, contracts and so on, quickly becomes outdated. So unless we have taught students how to find the new law and analyse the new law and use it, then they're going to be outdated themselves within 1 or 2 years of actually leaving law school. And another reason, so this is why we should teach skills at law school, I think, is because law school is a safe learning environment. Students are not practicing and making mistakes, because most of us make mistakes, particularly in the early years of our career. It's a safe environment. Students are not practicing on real clients, so they can. They're not putting anyone at risk when they learn skills at law school. Whereas if they wait until they get into practice, then unfortunately they will continue to learn by making mistakes, but the mistakes will be made on real clients rather than in a simulated condition, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And finally, another reason, perhaps the last reason I'll mention for students as to why we should teach skills at law school, and it's this: students really enjoy it. And if they enjoy what they're doing, then they're going to be motivated to learn. If they don't have that sense of enjoyment and accomplishment, then I don't think learning is such a fun activity. And learning can be fun. There's nothing which says that learning has to be boring and dull.
Libby, why do you think it's important that we teach skills in addition to knowledge?
Thanks, Nick. Well, I've got a very simplistic view around this, and for me it's about bringing subjects to life. Like, I guess, for example, and I'm in contrast here because I am lucky enough to teach subjects like negotiation, and I know the students love learning about negotiation, but I also teach a really dry subject called civil procedure, and civil procedure is about learning rules, and those rules are really boring, but it's probably one of the most important subjects that a student learns. So if I just stand up in the classroom and talk about those rules, I can see the vacant spaces in the classroom. So to bring it to life, it's important to marry it up with what that means when they go out into practice and what they're going to do. So we actually practice drafting documents that relate back to those rules. So I guess that it's about the theory having a context for me. And if it doesn't, I don't think you get the student engagement, which of course then leads to them not learning, they disengage. The other important reason from my perspective is that I think students need to take responsibility for their own learning. And one of the best ways to do that is to get them to do it, to actually practice the skill. And Bobette made the point, and I'd just reinforce it. I think our skills program and the teaching of skills provides a medium for us to teach those layers that Bobette talked about in terms of values, ethics, professionalism, so that students go out understanding the relevance of those and the importance, if you like, of those concepts in terms of real life. So I think it's important for us not only to teach skills, but to teach them in conjunction with those things like ethics, values, standards. And so weaving in ethical dilemmas to the teaching of skills is really important to me. And it's as simple as making sure that students turn up to a skills presentation dressed appropriately. You know, they're not in their boxer shorts and their t-shirts and their thongs, that they respect the importance of being professional. So, in a nutshell, that's what I think about the importance of teaching practical skills as well as knowledge. And to me, you can't get the knowledge without being able to apply that knowledge.
Okay, thanks. Jackson?
So I'll just add a few short things because Bobette and Libby covered most of the key ones. But for me, first and foremost, it's about student satisfaction and, in a sense, I guess, responding to student demand, because the days of shoveling content down their throats are long gone, and they really express a strong desire to do actual exercises, and I'm in a fortunate position, I guess, in getting them in their first semester to be able to see that enthusiasm, and also to have the ability to have a go at everything, really, because I teach the introductory subject, so I really give them an introduction to all of the legal skills, which is a really fortunate position to be in, because they do really enjoy them. So that makes the classroom environment for me a lot better, because I get the opportunity to a lot of skills. Sometimes I think I do too many, and that's the main problem, I think. So I think in terms of student satisfaction too, performance is a really important part of legal training, and they need to understand that from early on in their degrees, and particularly mooting and negotiation. They're real performance type exercises, and they love getting dressed up in a suit and pretending to be someone else and acting in that context, and I think it really brings out the best in them. There really are significant learning outcomes that happen over a very short period of time. Those who have had experience, I think, particularly with mooting, it's incredible the amount of development you can get in a student in such a short period of time. It's a big part of our program is doing external mooting competitions, and when you coach a mooting team and you see the development in just a month of preparation, it's extraordinary how much that student can develop through that practical exercise. One other thing shortly is I think the corollary is the importance for us as academics, because it forces us to assess the practical application aspects of the content that we deliver, which is a really good thing. It makes us consider carefully the nature of the content and how we can bring practical application into that. And there's almost an obligation on us to do that, I think, at this law school, because we have such small classes. So it is really easy to do. So I almost feel a sense of obligation to try and do as many creative things as possible, because it's quite an easy environment to do it when you only have 10 students in a tutorial, for example.
So Jackson's teaching skills to people right at the beginning of their law degree, but Tanya, you're teaching
At
skills
the
to
other
people who are right at the very end and about to move out into professional practice.
Yes, that's right, Nick. So I guess in some ways we're like the finishing school on top of the undergraduate program. So PLT students come to us for a very short period of time, 1 semester or 2 semesters part-time. We have a large component that are online, which in itself creates a lot of issues trying to teach skills if you're online. They do come and see us for a number of weeks before and, at the beginning and at the end of the course, but apart from that, the rest of the time they're in cyberspace, which is something that brings its own issues and different methods of dealing with that. But yes, we are really the end of the line, if you like, and they're very, very much, probably some of them are 6 months away from being admitted. So we feel quite some pressure, I guess personally, to ensure that we enhance the skills that they've already received in the undergraduate program. We're acutely aware that they need these skills very, very quickly if they don't already have them, because we obviously receive students from other universities, and those universities aren't necessarily focusing on the same skills as Bond. But yes, we're acutely aware that they'll be going into programs where they'll be working in work experience. So part-timers actually start when they come to us in their part-time position, in their full-time placement in firms. So there's a real burden, I guess, on those of us in the program to really ensure that we're doing the right thing as far as enhancing those skills. And I guess professionally, I'm in practice, so I know what they need to do, and I find I really enjoy actually talking about my own experiences with them. There's a lot of positive feedback from students when you can talk about experiences that you've had yourself or show them practical examples.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to show the first of a series of demonstration videos, so you can see what we're talking about when we say we get our students to demonstrate their skills in the classroom. Jackson has put these videos together with assistance from the team at OLT, of course. Did you want to give us just a little bit of background or context to the first one about interviewing?
Yeah, sure. So the client interview is a really important skill, but one that I guess in the law school, one of the few skills that we only assess once. A number of the skills we assess at multiple different levels. That said, they do a sort of introductory interview exercise in their first semester, but their main assessment is in a subject called business associations. And I'm aware of a couple of people, I mean, like myself, who in their elective subjects also do a client interview. But this one in particular is the teacher is Craig Smith, who teaches business associations. So it's generally a basic sort of commercial law problem. They, like most of our skills exercises, they'll generally get a 2-hour presentation from the academic beforehand, coupled with relevant prescribed readings. And they'll conduct the exercise generally for about half an hour or so. So this is obviously not half an hour, it's just a short snippet that I've created just to give you a rough idea of how it works. And very quickly, the problem just involves partnerships. So it's Craig's pretending to be a truckie who's had a few problems with his business. He's gone into a joint venture with a few mates and it all fell apart. So they're trying to resolve things and make sure that all his assets and so forth are protected. And he's a bit concerned that the others are going to have a crack at getting his business now that he's done a few things with them. So.
Okay, and obviously you guys are all coming into this cold, but I want you to have a go. As you're watching the video, would you give this student a fail, a pass, a credit, a distinction, or a high distinction for their performance?
Mr. Dawes, is it?
Yes, it is. How are you?
Mr. Dawes, nice to meet you. Morgan Windsor, how are you?
Good, thanks, Morgan. How are you?
Good, thanks. Please take a seat.
Over here?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Fantastic, thank you.
Mr. Dawes, you don't mind if I call you Alex?
Oh no, look, please, yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Oh, fantastic. It's a bit hot in here. Do you mind if I take that job?
Look, I'd prefer it if you just relax. I'm a little bit nervous, don't really deal with lawyers that much, so
no
that's
worries.
fine.
I'm pretty easygoing, so I think we'll be okay.
Excellent.
So, Alex, how about the current sort of political situation? A bit dodgy,
Isn't it a bit of a joke? You're sort of wondering where politics is going in this country.
Outrageous.
It's crazy,
anyway,
isn't it?
it's the way it works these days.
Sure.
So, Alex, before we get started, I just wanted to sort of let you know that, between these four walls, anything I say doesn't leave these walls. So, be free and open with me. We can talk about whatever you want.
Great, that's good to hear.
And, it's between you and me.
Fantastic.
And more than happy to take a break at any point that you feel necessary.
I'm on a bit of a time limit, but we should be fine. I'll let
Fantastic, no worries. And also, just so there's no surprises, I'd like to sort of just give a bit of an overview of how I sort of like to run things, and let me know sort of how you feel with that, whether you like to sort of amend that, change things.
Sure. And you'll let me know what happens for the rest of it.
So Alex, I know you've previously discussed your concerns with some of our other lawyers. However, I think it'd be important to sort of get a perspective in your own words from start to finish what's brought you here today.
Sure, okay. Well listen, it's not really a complicated scenario. I own a bit of a trucking business, and a couple of friends of mine got into some hard times, and I had a bit of an idea where we could get together and set up a business utilising their skills and my skills, and unfortunately it's all gone a bit pear-shaped. Look, it started probably about 2 years ago, and so look, at the end of the day we're now in conflict. I just basically want to get rid of them and continue on my own. It's time for me to wrap this up, and I need to know where I stand, so that's why I've come here today.
Okay. I'm disappointed to hear that that's how it sort of all turned out.
Yeah, sometimes, and they were friends, and that's the tough part.
Oh, that's no good, Alex. So what is it exactly that you sort of want to get out of our meeting today?
Well, the main thing, I guess, is that they're claiming that they're partners. I don't really know what that means at law, but when I spoke to your boss, when I rang him up, he basically said I needed to come in and find out exactly what our arrangement was so that you guys could tell me where I stand. What I want to do is I just want to separate myself from this and get on with my life.
Thanks for that, Alex. That's a really good overview. I just wanted to take you back to a few particular points,
Sure.
just to get some clarity on a few things, just to get the whole picture.
Yeah.
Specifically first, where does the business operate? Where does the business operate?
The whole business is set up. I already had a big yard for my own business, Doors Trucking, and everything was set up in that. I had one small corner there. It's like a couple of acres. One small corner with a shed that was already there. So we've just fenced that off with a bit of cyclone fencing, and we're utilising that as the business premises for this venture.
Okay, and who owns that?
I own everything. The whole lease for the property is under my name. I just fenced off one corner.
Okay, fantastic. So Alex, it looks like you might be in what is called a joint venture, but I'm not going to bore you with the legal details of that.
Yeah.
However, if I'm right, it appears that your lease is safe.
Oh, good.
And that you won't lose your trucks. However, don't hold me to that. So please don't take any action until I've undertaken some further research on that, and I'll get back to you on those particular points.
So does that mean you're not sure at this stage?
I'm quite confident. However, I think that it's better to be safe than sorry. So I think that we should just hold off undertaking any further action until I've clarified some points with my partners and
Sure, okay.
have undertaken further research.
Okay, that sounds great. What about the de facto thing? Because look, that's weighing on my mind, mate.
Yeah, in relation to that, I'm certainly not an expert in the area, so I can't provide you with any advice in relation to that point. However, John down the hall is a bit of a rock star in the family law area.
Oh, fantastic.
And so I'm more than happy to put you
Can I
in
speak to
contact
him?
with him
Okay,
for
that'd
that.
be good. All right,
Fantastic.
That'll cover the bases there. So, where to from here? What happens?
So Alex, I know that you're on some time restraints, so we might
Sure.
wrap it up now.
Okay.
So as discussed, I'll conduct some further research on those particular points in relation to the lease
Yep.
and also the trucks.
Sure.
And in the meantime, what would be great is if you could provide me with perhaps the lease, the bank accounts and the tax statements and other business records of the business.
All those things we discussed. Just
Yeah,
then,
that'd be fantastic. When do you think you'd be able to get to me? those
Oh,
particular
I want
documents?
this to move quickly, of course. I could probably have it done over the weekend.
Oh, fantastic. So perhaps by Monday.
Yeah, I can have them back to you by Monday. Yep.
Fantastic. So I think if we get the documents by Monday, I should be able to get more concrete advice to you by perhaps Thursday.
All right.
How does that sound for you?
Yeah, sounds good. Yep.
Fantastic. So perhaps we could make another appointment this time next week, Thursday.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got a gap in a window in my schedule, which is regular, so I can come back same time next week.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that will work perfectly. And so, yeah, I'll be able to provide you with more concrete advice at that particular time.
All right, that sounds good.
Fantastic.
All right, so all I got to do is get the documents by Monday, and then I can leave it in your capable hands.
Absolutely.
All right, mate. I've got a plane to catch, so I better zip off.
No worries, Alex. It was
Look,
great
thanks
to
for
meet
it.
you.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank
All right,
you.
thank you. Okay, look, Morgan, thanks. That was great. Great performance all up to start with. I can give you some good feedback, though, to try and help you a bit here. Look, at the starting point when we came in the door, hard to criticise you on that. That handshake and starting off with the formal names and asking to use my first name is great techniques, and the jacket, absolutely love it, because what you did is you changed a formal environment into a casual environment with little subtle clues. The only thing that I really didn't like about how we sat down is when you sat me down, see how we're sitting now, because we're talking naturally, this is what you want naturally. You were sitting over that side of the table,
Yep.
a little bit far away for that interpersonal communications. But other than that, that was a great opening, that was really good. When we were obtaining the overview from the client, look, it was great how you did that. Most important, not to interrupt, let them roll on, because that's when you get the good information. You can always come back and clarify. Some people butt in and then the client loses their place and you lose valuable information. So look, all that was really good. And I liked how you were doing the nodding, just like you're doing now, and that sounded a bit tough. You know, the empathy was important, how you kept that going was good. What I think you could have improved a little bit on that was when you tried to identify their key concerns, because that's a really critical part of it. You could have worded that a little bit better, because it's so important that you structure the rest of your interview based upon what's important to your client.
Okay,
is the
so
key
any
thing.
advice on that particular point?
Well, actually there is. There's a good tip. I always use the same thing, and I'll pretend that you're the client. I go, okay, Morgan, thanks for that. That's a great overview. I understand what's going on. But listen, if I could ask you, this is obviously important to you, what kept you awake last night? What's annoying you the most? If I could ask you what's the singular thing that you'd like fixed, if I could do it right now, what would it be? And your client usually tells you, and then you say, what's the second thing? And you get an order. And if he says the least is the most important, talk about the least first. Because if you don't, every question you ask your client, he'll be going, this, blah, blah, blah. But in the back of his mind, he'll be saying, but what about the bloody lease? It'll be, so satisfy what's causing him concern, and the rest comes out easy. Okay. So that was all pretty good. Look, the structure was really good. Critical listening's important. You have to hear not just the answers to your questions, but also the extra things that they say. And I think you did a great job on picking up on those cues. You know, when you picked up about the costs of the actual invoices for the product, that wasn't the question you asked, but you said, you just said invoices. Brilliant. That was a really good example of what we were talking about. So you didn't get that tunnel vision thinking that you'd sorted it out. The preliminary advice, again, really good. It's so important not to say, this is what I think, because the client then thinks the problem's solved. You said you can't hold me to it, and it's really, really good. But you did miss out a vital stage on there. When you gave that advice, generate some options. What about alternative dispute resolution? These people were his friends. Does he want to go to the highest court in the land, or maybe mediation and they can just sort it out? If you provided those options now, you were planting the seed. You don't really know what your client wants to do and how far he wants to take it. So talk about those other things. Okay. And wrapping it up at the end, look, what a great way to end it. What are you going to do? What do you expect the client to do? All the bells and whistles were going off. It looked like your client walked out the door confident that everything was being taken care of and that they had a bit of a job to do, so they feel like they're being involved. Get those documents to me, and they knew exactly what was going to happen without any ambiguity. So look, a good way to wrap it up. All in all, a pretty good performance, mate. Job well done.
Fantastic. Thanks
Cheers.
very much.
All right.
So we'll go back to the panel questions now. We're just going to mix things up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is ask each panelist to share their answers to the second and third questions together. So how do you actually teach and assess skills using simulations, and what practical tips do you have for anyone in the room who might be interested in giving this a go? So Libby?
Thanks, Nick. Okay, because I teach a range of skills, I guess I've over time developed some various methods of doing it, and I get students to engage in actual role plays where they play out the part of a person who might be conducting a negotiation. They might also be an actual mediator conducting a mediation session, that sort of thing. I also use case studies that I've developed for my own practice, particularly as a mediator. So I use case studies. In terms of it being live, there are other things that I think are really valuable, and it's something that I've learnt gets the respect of students in terms of their learning, and that's me modelling a lot of the skills that I'm teaching. So I'm prepared to put myself on the line, I suppose, particularly when it comes to things like communication skills, which are really at the heart of dispute resolution skills. The other thing that I do in my, as I said, really dry civil procedure subject is I get the students to actually draft documents in the lectures that I conduct. So I don't do the traditional 2-hour lecture. I have an hour of talking, and then I get them to actually draft a document. And I consider that to be a live simulation. But then I give them my sample of that draft as well. And we have a discussion about that because they might have done it differently to me. The other thing that I do is I've conducted a series of recorded interviews with practitioners, and I upload those to iLearn so that they can watch them. So they're not a live simulation, but they're good examples of what they'll do in practice. And the other thing that works really, really, really effectively with teaching things like dispute resolution is that we actually use coaches. So we have our students in our dispute resolution courses actually working with a coach. So they will actually do the simulation and the coach will stop them and debrief with them as they go. So they get their feedback immediately, and that's one point that I'll make in time. So I think they're the main things that I use. So I think varying it too is a really important aspect of it, and keeping it real.
Okay. We'll pass over to Tanya now.
I was going to do 3.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. You want to do that now? Yeah.
Sorry. The third question or issue that we were asked to think about was giving practical tips to someone who might be embarking on teaching skills. And I actually do think skills are difficult to teach, particularly if you're an academic who hasn't been exposed to skills. I mean, the 3 of us on this panel have all been legal practitioners or are still legal practitioners. I've sort of transgressed into mediation more lately. And I think to some extent, knowing what the skills are makes it easier to teach them. That doesn't necessarily mean that just because we've been practitioners, we're good at teaching skills, okay? So I think we've all had to learn by trial and error as to what works. But in terms of my practical tips, I think you need to think about having very clear learning outcomes, having very clear expectations, but making sure you align and you scaffold. So for me, alignment is about, in a theoretical subject like civil procedure, that I actually assess the skill, not just during the course of doing the subject, but as part of the final exam or the final assessment. So alignment is really important to me as a skills teacher. So make sure you get that right. And I think you have to develop frameworks or scaffolds to support students through that process. Developing a bank of skills resources, okay? Students love examples. Students feel a lot more comfortable if you can model something for them or you can hand them something once they've done it. And I think it validates what we do as skills teachers. The other thing that, and students don't like this, but I actually am a great believer in getting students to reflect and evaluate on what they've done. So my practical tip to new skill teachers is you need to develop, if you like, a pro forma reflection/evaluation that students can actually complete based on what you've got them to do. So I think having those is really important. Having assessment criteria or assessment rubrics. I mean, if I'm going to do an assessment, I'm going to feel very uncomfortable if I don't know what I'm being assessed on. And those, I actually think that the generic rubrics don't work so well for skills assessments, and they need to be very specific to what you're assessing on in terms of your expectations as to what you want them to be able to do as far as that skill is concerned. Okay, providing feedback. We saw a good example of that, and one point I would make about that when you're starting off, Craig actually worked with the student and he talked to the student at the student's level. So again, I think when you're providing feedback, don't overdose. Don't have feedback on every single thing that they do because they'll never remember it. So be selective about the feedback you give and do it in a positive, constructive way, the way Craig did. And the other thing that Craig did that I think is really important when you're learning to teach skills, give them a practical example of how that would work in practice, as we saw Craig do with a real client. So giving feedback is really important. And the other 2 last things, I think it's important to make your materials credible. I like practitioners. I've still got a lot of colleagues in practice. I get them to look at what I've done. And I think getting them to have a look at your material to make sure it's still relevant and current is really important. And my motto, and I guess it's the thing I would leave you with, is this is about students trying before they buy. And I think the important thing for skills teaching is when they go out into the real world, they're not going to have the safe, supported environment. So we need to give them lots of opportunities and examples to learn from. So have that bank of resources, as I've said. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Libby. Tanya, how do you do it, and what tips do you have?
Well, just following on from what Libby has run through, I can only agree with her. I guess we're very lucky in PLT because we have a different way of assessing our students. They're assessed as competent and not competent, and that's taken a lot of the pressure off the students, I think, because they understand then that the ultimate goal is for us to get them up to a higher skill level, and the grade's not important. I think it makes them braver to try things. So I get a few things that we do, I think, as far as the live simulations. To give you an example, each subject or module that they do, they basically start from the client instructions and do different activities and work their way through to an actual file that they hand in. So they're replicating practical work conditions, and we try and replicate those conditions as the assessor by being more of a mentor and encouraging them to talk to us and ask us and give us drafts, because in reality you don't get a score in legal practice, and your mentor hopefully will give you a nice, few notes back on your document and say try it again. So we're very much following a practice-based approach. A couple of examples of our live sort of simulations. We obviously have client interviews. We try and give scenarios which will show pitfalls that happen in practice. So we might give them a very brief scenario, but it's actually quite misleading. So they get in expecting a family law matter, and it's the client that's confused about what's a family law matter and what isn't. And we get students to act in the roles. As Libby said, it's very good experience for them to experience being the client. We also have them actually acting as witnesses, which is quite funny, because when they get to be cross-examined, they get this defensive role, they cross their arms, and suddenly they're in the role of a witness. And I think they appreciate how hard it is to be a witness, and all lawyers say to their clients, you'll be fine, just get in the witness box and give your evidence. But it's actually quite stressful, even as a student, being cross-examined. So we do use a lot of practical examples. I guess the most important thing about starting out, a few things we've been developing in the most recent years we've been running the program, is building on similar facts scenarios. So giving the students one set of facts, asking them to do the research, and then using those facts to then build the letter of advice, and then using those facts to then build into, say, an ADR negotiation. And by building on each level, it sort of adds a lot to it. If you keep giving them separate examples, I think they just don't engage particularly well with the material. A couple of the different things that we use, I've found because we have so many online students, we have to do quite a few things by telephone. I have found a very effective free product, teleconference product. If you go through the usual channels, it's this horrendous charge per hour, but I've actually found a free one if anybody's looking. I've also found a fantastic Blackboard app that allows you to enter oral feedback into Gradebook. And as someone who can have, say, 20 students submitting 18 assessments over one semester, you can imagine how tedious it can be at the end of the day, continually typing in feedback, which you probably sense they won't read anyway. And I've trialled it for a couple of semesters, and they just love it. They love the fact that they can just listen to the feedback very quickly, scroll down the document, see what I'm talking about, and then they're done. So the app that's been developed by Blackboard is fantastic. It's only available on an iPad, so you virtually work with the iPad next to your screen. The only downside is it's one take only. So if you muck it up or cough or something, someone walks in or a fire engine goes past, then you have that recorded. But those are the sort of technological changes that we've been implementing into our practice. The new Collaborate, I don't know if you're familiar with the Collaborate program, but there's a new version this semester, much better than the last one, much more like an app, so much easier to use. So they're probably the main tips. The last thing probably is, keep the PowerPoints to a minimum. They hate PowerPoints. Research what people are saying about PowerPoints and how essentially your eye is faster than your hearing. So once someone's read the PowerPoint, they don't want to hear you go through point by point because they've already read it, and that's why you get the glazed over look. So in our course, they've done an undergraduate degree, and we do try as much as we can to use practical examples, send them off to do their own research, and then come back and talk about the answers. And the last thing I think is probably important is try and get students to open their minds a little bit. Many students have a set sort of view about, well, I'm no good at advocacy, you know, English isn't even my first language, I'm so nervous about doing a hearing. Then you get the student who says, I've done 64 moots and I'm fabulous and I'm going to be a civil litigator. And sometimes the one who thinks they're going to be fantastic actually isn't as good as someone else who's been very quiet for the whole semester in class. And so you sort of have to open their mind a little bit to perhaps take some of their preconceptions away, because they're not always the best. I don't think any of us are always the best at identifying our own skills. And so we've found it's really good to try and just encourage them to participate. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Tanya. Jackson, how do you teach and assess skills, and what tips do you have for us?
Well, I mentioned that I'm fortunate to be able to do a lot of the skills, the primary legal skills, with our introduction to law students, so mooting and negotiation and client interviews and those sorts of things. But in my elective subject, animal law, I've a lot more freedom to do all sorts of creative things, which over the 7 or 8 years of teaching that course has been a really important part of the subject for me and the students, I think. So in an assessment context, you know, we have a set process generally, as I said, where we provide a lecture and provide materials and so forth, and we set up times, scheduled times and so forth. But I think it's also important to just incorporate general skills exercises into the day-to-day classes as well, rather than just in the assessment modules. And so I've trialled a lot of things in animal law and in the Australian legal system as well. But some of the the more interesting ones that have gone really well, for example, is, and I'm always trying to keep it with something that's in the media at the time, something that's current and topical, and a lot of the time something that I've done in practice at the same time as well, so something that I can actually share some war stories about that particular area with them. Such as, for instance, mock parliamentary committee meeting with live animal export. So you have representatives from the government and representatives from the agricultural lobby and representatives from the animal welfare organisations and so forth. The students really love that, and it's a very topical issue. Strategic litigation proposals, so picking a really tricky area that needs reform and having students actually think really constructive about what the rules should be, rather than just trying to deconstruct what the rules already are. Legislative proposals, preparing a brief for a barrister. And I guess the most ambitious one I tried a couple of years ago that I haven't retried yet, I think I'll do it a little bit better last time. It worked well to a certain extent. Was I tried to model essentially a pro bono animal law service. So I set it up like a law firm and made up a whole bunch of clients, and you know, it worked relatively well, but I learned a lot from that experience. And I guess which is one of my tips is that preparation is key, as it is with all things, and that sometimes flying by the seat of your pants works great, other times it doesn't. But it's, you know, things like that really do open the gates, though, in terms of creativity in your teaching, and you really find things within yourself, I think, when you trial things like that that really benefit you in the long term. And certainly the students really enjoyed it, but I felt from an academic perspective there were a lot of weaknesses, which is always the case. I mean, when you try something first, and that's part of the fun with this, I think, is being open and honest with students, telling them what you're trying to achieve very clearly by stating the learning outcomes and re-impressing those learning outcomes on them consistently as you're instructing them and as you're providing feedback. So just quickly some practical tips, and the others have already touched on some really important ones, but just in the context, I won't refer to those that are relevant to assessment, but rather those that are relevant to just classroom exercises. I think importantly it's to be really conscious of the class size and the teaching space. I've tried a lot of exercises with large classes that don't work as effectively. There are exercises that work with big groups, and you just have to think very carefully about the number of students and how it's going to play out. You know, generally when you've got between 10 or 20 students, everything's quite easy. But once you move beyond that, it becomes a much more strategic process to get it right. The teaching space is also obviously really important, and we've all had battles with timetabling over rooms that we get allotted for subjects. I hate tiered theatres to teach in. I much prefer flat rooms, and that's predominantly because we have the ability to break out and group work and so forth. And it makes a huge difference. Trying to conduct exercises in tiered rooms is very, very difficult. In terms of the instruction, so that was the environment. In terms of the instruction, I think, the quality of the sell, of selling it to the students as an idea and something that they're going to enjoy and benefit a lot from is really important, and trying to engage them and maintain their enthusiasm throughout the whole process. And there's a lot of different ways in which you can do that. And, a lot of it really comes down to, as Libby said, simulating things yourself, providing really really thorough and accurate instruction, giving them a lot of resources, and getting guests as well. I find that really helps, having external guests by using Skype or sometimes in person to come in and talk specifically about that skill, using experts to, impress the students in terms of, being able to engage with someone who's at the coalface with that particular skill. And of course, as I mentioned there, you don't always have to get them in person. I think that's a really important thing, particularly when we're on the Gold Coast. And for most of us, the experts in our areas are generally, if not in Brisbane, in Sydney and Melbourne and so forth. And I think I have as many, if not more, international guests than I do Australian guests these days because of Skype and the ability to use that in really effective ways that don't have the same sense of guilt that you feel when you make a guest presenter drive all the way from Brisbane. Or even I've had a few fly up from Sydney before and you really feel a sense of guilt. But, Skype is a great way to overcome that. In terms of the actual assessment, look, a lot of what I'd planned to say has already been said, so I'll just be brief. Reiterating that the reflection in the context of feedback is a really important part of the process. I think the other video, you'll see in that negotiation how Kylie, she assesses our early degree students with negotiation, and it's really important to get them to give you feedback first, to try and assess how they think they went and reflect on the exercise, and getting them to write it down and then refer to it in the context of giving them oral feedback. And the only other point was the appropriate number of exercises. You don't want to overburden them. And as I said, I think that's maybe a weakness that I've identified in my skills teaching, is that sometimes I'm a little bit too ambitious and try to squeeze too much in, and you've got to be really strategic about what sort of exercises work with what type of content. And I've done it for a number of years now, and I think I've got the mix right, but it took me a while to get that right. So that's about it.
Okay. Thank you,
Yeah. So you're going to show the negotiation?
We'll show the negotiation video. It's a very good video. So can we?
So just a bit of context. These are first semester students, so very fresh, and this is not an assessment exercise in their first semester. So they literally have, an hour or two of instruction beforehand, but they still get in the rooms with the double pane glass and so forth that we have in the law school, and throw a suit on and those sort of things. So it's a real simulation, but they don't get assessed on it. It's really an introduction to the exercise that they do get assessed on the semester after. But we might just watch a little bit of the negotiation. We might fast forward again to the feedback, I think, because that's the most important aspect for the purposes of this presentation. But quick context, essentially what they're doing in this negotiation is I try to choose something pretty fun for first semester students, not make it a property law problem or a commercial problem that requires them to learn a lot of content. I make it a negotiation between a rock star and a record label. So they're negotiating a record deal. So they all get interested in that and learn a little bit about what's involved in a record deal. And obviously they are not the rock star and the record label, they are the lawyers representing those parties. But they really engage well when they have to think about all the things that are involved in the music industry and so forth. But they're always very nervous and very conscious of the mistakes that they make, even though they've had very little instruction. So both these students are very fresh. So there's plenty of feedback I'm sure you could all give to them.
guys, we're ready to begin.
Hey, how you going?
Brynn.
Jamie, was it?
Yeah, Jamie. Good to meet you.
Yep, you too. Let's take a seat. So we'll start by writing up an agenda.
Okay.
Yep. So we've got a number of things that we still have left to resolve. Artist management, merchandise, online streaming, national tour, record release, image, etc. So we'll start with the online streaming. AOH had some ideas. Look, they were looking at running a 24-hour live streaming feed on her website and just leading up to the release of the album. Does she have any problem with that, or?
My client would rather not do that, obviously, for privacy reasons. She's expressed that before. She feels that it wouldn't even necessarily be that positive a thing for the Afraid of Heights.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of research that suggests that it really draws the fans in, and especially leading up to the album release, it'll really get her image out there, and we're hoping that that'll boost record sales for her first album. Is there any particular aspect of it that she has a problem with, or?
My client is mostly worried about not having any downtime, because when the cameras are on you 24/7, you always have to be on.
Yeah.
And as a result, that could even create stress, negatively impact the quality of her work, etc.
Okay. So it's really just
reducing the amount of time.
Yeah. So maybe not 24 hours a day, but
yeah.
Okay. We'll move on to the next point. Gary is her manager now. Like, I got to be honest, we're not a fan of Gary. Seems like a nice guy and everything, but the problem is, and we've seen it before, is that if their managers have any sort of romantic relationship with the artist they're managing, it all just falls apart. I mean, is she really that keen on Gary being her manager?
I understand where you're coming from, and so does Jenny. She has those questions herself.
Yeah.
But she's been in this with Gary for a long time.
Sure, yeah.
Gary has been positive for her for a long time.
Yeah.
They know how to work together.
Yeah.
Gary could even help you manage her as someone who knows her well.
We're not. We're not too sure. I mean, we would be willing. I mean, my clients have indicated to me that they would be willing to bring Gary in a position within the company, along the lines of a business development position, but we really don't want her to be associated with managing Jenny. Really, even in a co-management role, at this stage, it would just be premature. Perhaps if he proves himself, he could be brought in to have a role with Jenny's management. And even then, AOH would really only consider bringing him in if there were some significant concessions on Jenny's part.
Okay, I'll take a note of that.
Yep, okay, cool.
As an alternative to the 24-hour streaming, we were wondering my client was wondering, if she could pre-record a certain number of segments per day, like a diary can.
Sorry to interrupt. Just before you go any further, my client was really stressing the point about it being live.
Yes.
Perhaps they could concede somewhere on the 24 hours a day thing, but really they were really hoping, really quite adamant that they wanted it to be a live streaming. Sorry, go on.
Okay, I'll speak to my client about that. Yeah. Perhaps we could do a mix of both.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, obviously, both parties want to come to a win-win solution here.
Once again, I just want to reiterate that my client really is not interested in letting...
Do you feel that we aren't really getting anywhere on this issue? Should we move along to the merchandise agenda?
We are a bit stuck on this one, but it was really very important to AOH Records that there's no double album. There's really, like, if you look at history, no good bands have ever
I know what you're saying.
pulled off
So
a double album.
do we need a break from this agenda item? Because
I
obviously
think
we're not getting anywhere.
if we can, so let me just summarise. We've got we're looking at a mixture of online streaming and pre-recorded footage for the website.
And a lot of that will come from her writing hiatus in Iceland.
Okay, sure.
Where she's doing touristy things, which would be obviously awesome footage.
Sure.
And then recording in some romantic cave in a mountain somewhere.
Yeah,
for
I'll
example.
just make a note of that one. Thanks for that.
Go on.
We've still got some problems with Gary, but we can revisit that at some stage. Looks like we've reached some tentative approval on the merchandise issue, which is good.
My client wants to keep Gary on board as a manager because they have a long-standing relationship. It's worked in the past.
The position of AOH is that we would like him separate from the team. We'd like an internal management situation.
Well, let's stick with the interests. And
okay,
what's your interest behind that position?
The interest is that Jenny is well represented and that she has a professional team.
Well, thank you for today. I think we've come a long way.
Yeah,
agreed on a lot of issues. But as I said, I have to be at a meeting by 1:30,
Yeah, sure.
so I have to get out of here.
Yeah, no worries. We'll pick up where we left off next week.
Awesome. Thank you.
Enjoy your next meeting.
Yes, I definitely will.
Hi guys, well done.
Thank you.
Now, before I give you my feedback, I'm just going to give you these self-reflection forms. We spoke about them in class. So this is just a bit of self-reflection. And what I'll do is I'll just get you to look at each of the questions and answer them, try and reflect on your negotiation, and then I'll pop back in a few minutes and give you some feedback.
Cool,
All right,
thank you.
thanks.
Awesome.
All right, you filled out your self-reflection?
Yep.
All right, so what we'll do first is I'll just go through your self-reflection with you, ask you a few questions, and then I'll give you my feedback. So in reflecting on the entire negotiation exercise, if you were faced with a similar situation again, what would you do the same? Might start with BRYNN.
Well, we tried to sort of work through the different interests and stuff that each of our clients had. Regrettably, we probably didn't do that as well, but I think it was right to sort of have a go at that. So definitely would have a go at that again.
This is your first negotiation, or one of your first negotiations, so you are being a bit tough on yourself. There are certainly there were many positives. Now you're obviously going to have some opportunities to do some more negotiations throughout your degree in some of your subjects. So the feedback I'm going to give you today is really designed for the first semester student or an early degree student moving into the exercises that you'll be doing throughout your degree. So I do tend to focus on things that you could improve, but I'll try and highlight all the things I saw you doing well as we go. Given that you're lawyers, and this is a transactional negotiation, so it's what we call a front-end negotiation, so you're agreeing to a contract rather than trying to resolve a dispute, which we call a back-end negotiation. So the processes for those are slightly different. So when you're negotiating a contract, it's really important that the lawyers agree certain procedures before they proceed to negotiate. Probably the most important is confidentiality. Because this is a transaction the parties are about to enter into, it's got to be confidential. In this particular scenario, we might even have media attention. So very important to agree that what happens in the room and the parties' discussions and the fact they're potentially entering into a transaction is confidential. So just make sure you set up the procedure before you start. It was really good that you identified the parties' interests. It was really good to see we spoke about interests in class, and I thought you both did a really good job there. I would have liked to have seen you set out some common goals to begin with and put those up on the whiteboard. The benefit in doing that is obviously that the parties are grounded towards their common goals and it facilitates discussion and agreement. If there's any sticking point, you can always come back to the common goals, and if you've written them up on the board, it's easier to do that. Okay, so it was really good to see, again, the interests put on the board. it's sometimes useful to develop an agenda. Okay, so as we spoke about in class, you'd usually write the agenda on the board, and that would be agreed. Yeah, I mean the interest can go on the board, and that was quite good. As I said, that was certainly a good thing to do. But if you put an agenda on the board that outlines all the things the parties need to discuss, and you agree that amongst yourselves, and that it's mutual and neutral, so no blaming type of language, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Probably should have.
Yeah.
Do that one next time.
And that keeps the parties on track from a timing perspective. And again, if you sort of get into a difficult situation, you can easily move to the next, but you remember to go back to the issue that you might have struggled with. Yeah.
Would you ever write the agenda before you go into the meeting?
Yeah, that is often the case in practice. You've got to be a bit careful with that, because presenting the agenda to the other side before you can go in can look a little positional.
Okay, cool.
But sometimes lawyers will pre-agree an agenda before they go in, particularly if it's a multi-party negotiation and in a large transaction with a lot of lawyers involved. I thought you did a really good job with your active listening. Thought you both listened to each other really well, and you demonstrated the skills of active listening. So I saw you acknowledging, I saw you reframing, and so that was well done. So good job there. You were both a bit too nice to each other. Obviously, you know, your manner needs to be nice and professional, and you were very good at that. But you've got to be quite assertive in protecting your client's interests. You do that with a nice professional manner, but you've still got to be assertive about your client's interests. So not giving concessions too easily, I think you identified earlier on. So while you were polite to each other and your manner was very professional, and that was good to see, you've got to still be quite assertive about your client's interests. I thought your offers were well considered, and I thought you moved towards agreement quite well. But I would have liked to have seen you more obviously trade concessions. So when you give something up, typically, you would try and get something in return for that. Okay, so when you were giving up concessions or making concessions as you were going, you should have tried to get something in return for that, or at least give the impression that once we get to another issue, perhaps you could be a little more flexible on that, because I've been flexible on this point. So that's good. So either sort of get a concession in return or bank the concession, we call that for later use.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, noted there were a few little stumbling blocks on some parts of the agreement, and that's to be expected. I mean, that happens all the time, and that's, to tell you the truth, if there are no stumbling blocks in a negotiation, you've probably not done such a good job. So it's actually expected that there will be stumbling blocks. You need to develop some skills in dealing with stumbling blocks. Now, that's a difficult thing to do in your first semester, so I probably didn't expect you to be able to really work with those stumbling blocks now, but it is a skill that perhaps you will be developing as you progress with your negotiations down the track. Creative problem solving is certainly one way, so that's if you focus on the parties' interests, why they want what they want, sometimes there's another solution. If you look at what they want, you might be here and here, but if you start to focus on why, you might find that there's another solution. So it's really important to summarise what's agreed, what's left to be agreed, and it's often useful to give yourself something to do or each other something to do in between. So is there any homework you need to do? It keeps the parties thinking about the matter, it progresses it. So think of anything that's outstanding, any more information that we need, so that that's all solved before we come back into the next meeting. It's also good for your client from a fees perspective. If you can keep, obviously the timing, if you can manage the timing, then your client will benefit from that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, but look, I thought you did a really good job. As I said, the first semester and the early degree negotiations are really difficult. And I think you used a lot of the skills that we taught you in class. You did that well.
Thanks very much.
Well done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I think you'll agree that Kylie was doing an excellent job there in providing feedback for the students. And if you're like me, you may have noticed that the students were not writing down every single thing that she was saying, which was very foolish of them. But that tends to happen a lot with our students. Okay then, so the final part of our presentation is going to be a more interactive exercise. So what we're going to do is divide you up into two groups. Oh look, it's already done. And we're going to take a few minutes now. We'll take about 10 minutes now to have a conversation around advocacy demonstrations and mooting, and try and come up with, and this will be harder for some tables than for other tables.
We should interchange. I'll come over there and maybe
That's a good idea too. Let's sprinkle the lawyers around and try and come up with a sort of set of criteria that you think you would use if you were trying to judge the quality of someone's courtroom advocacy skills. Then we'll play the video and we'll have a chat about how you went. All right, so 10 minutes now to come up with a list of marking criteria for judging and assessing someone's courtroom advocacy skills, and the lawyers on the table can explain what exactly that means.
So it's a little bit technical, like most things in law, but essentially the issue, well, firstly, by way of procedure, so we've got 3 judges here, which is a fair bit of pressure for the students. Ordinarily, they'd just have the course coordinator, so just one judge, but in this, for the purposes of the video, we had 3 judges and a bailiff to make it a little bit more realistic. And the problem is around free-range egg labelling, which is a topical issue. And we won't have both speakers. We'll just show you the first speaker, which is a slightly technical issue in the sense that it involves the admission of evidence. So an animal rights organisation has broken into a factory farm, taken undercover footage and photos, showed this to the ACCC, and the way in which they've obtained that evidence raises questions as whether the court can actually use that evidence for the purposes of the prosecution. So it's the ACCC prosecuting for misleading and deceptive conduct, a concept that you probably have heard of, even non-lawyers amongst you. You know, there was a case just last week very similar to this with a farm out at Toowoomba. So there's been, the ACCC's prosecuted these sort of things about 10 times in the last few years, so it's a pretty common thing that's got a lot of media. So the students had to argue that the evidence could be admitted. That's what our first speaker here is arguing. And secondly, that it was or was not misleading and deceptive, depending on what side that they were on. And obviously for the other side, they would argue in the first issue that the evidence should not be admitted. So we're just looking at one side. But you know, sometimes in assessment, depending on the context, we can assess 4 students at once. So we'll have 2 on one side, 2 on the other. And generally that makes more sense in terms of timing and so forth for the assessment.
Yes, may I have your appearances, please?
If it pleases the court, my name is Banerjee, initial A, and my co-counsel's name is Paskovich, initial C, and we're appearing for the applicant, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. Okay. Yes, Mr. Banerjee. Can you outline your case, please?
Your Honour, this case concerns the interest of the consumers and their rights to be properly informed about the production methods at the respondent's grocery stores, as well as the court's discretion to admit video footage that captures the true production methods that the respondent uses to produce its eggs and its meat. To this end, the applicant has 2 submissions. First, that the video footage captured by the AAA drone should be admitted under Section 138 of the Evidence Act. And second, that the applicant has a reasonable prospect of success to establish that the respondent has engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct under Section 18 of the Australian Consumer Law. Your Honour, I ask the court that we may dispense with full citations.
In the circumstances, yes, I don't have a problem with that. Yes.
Would
yes,
Your
go on,
Honours,
Mr. Banerjee.
Would Your Honours like a brief summary of the facts?
That would probably assist us, yes.
Your Honours, AAA, a non-for-profit organisation, flew an unmanned drone over Hive Industries, the supplier of eggs and meat to the respondent. The video footage captured animals being slaughtered by religious requirement, as well as eggs being produced in various forms, such as from cage-laid hens, as well as cage-free. The images were then presented on a current bazaar, and this resulted in a huge public outcry against the respondent. Your Honour, I will present the applicant's first submission, that the video footage captured by the AAA drone should be admitted under Section 138 of the Evidence Act. Your Honours, it is agreed that the footage was obtained improperly for the purposes of Section 138 of the Evidence Act. In order for the court, if it is open for the court to still find that the evidence is admissible, despite the impropriety, if the court determines that the desirability of admitting the evidence outweighs the undesirability of admitting the evidence. To determine this, the court may weigh and consider the factors listed in Section 138(3) of the Evidence Act.
Counsel, are there any of these factors that are more important than the others?
No, Your Honour. There's no... all these factors should be weighed and considered with respect to one another.
It just seems to me that the probative value of the evidence is probably the most important consideration. Am I incorrect?
With respect, Your Honour, that is the court's decision whether they should give greater weight to probative value or not, but the applicant submits that all these considerations should be considered equally.
Mr. Bamerjee, one of the things which strikes me about this is that you've got a piece of evidence which, if it is admissible, is going to have substantial impact on the outcome of this case. But it's evidence which is actually coming from a third-party source, isn't it?
Yes, Your Honour.
And it's a third-party source which, on my reading of the facts, was neither authorised nor excused by law from doing what it did. Is that not a difficulty in this case?
No, Your Honour. In terms of establishing whether the evidence is still desirable for admission, the court should consider the factors within Section 138(3) to properly determine if the evidence should still be admissible.
Right, and which factors are they?
Your Honour, the applicant submits that all the factors, bar subparagraph F and G, are required to be considered by the court, as these two subparagraphs have no relevance to the proceedings. Your Honour, under subparagraph A and B, the footage should be admitted into evidence as it has probative value and is important to these proceedings. Your Honours, the employment advocate and Williamson...
Counsel, what's the reason that you've grouped these two factors together but none of the other factors are grouped?
Your Honour, both these considerations work together quite well, which is why the applicant is submitting them together.
Work together quite well, Counsel. What does that mean?
In terms of establishing probative value, Your Honour, rather, in terms of establishing subparagraph B, whether the importance of the evidence, the test for that is whether there's no other evidence available to the proceedings untainted by impropriety and probative to the same facts and issue. And because of the test outlining that the evidence still needs to be probative to the same fact and issue, that it takes in consideration subparagraph A, which is why the applicant has grouped both of those two together.
So I'm not sure that I understand. You're saying importance includes an assessment of probative value but something else as well?
Whether there's any other evidence of equal probative value available to these proceedings. Here, Your Honour, the applicant submits that there's nothing on the facts to suggest that there is any other evidence available to these proceedings. And because of this, this evidence is important to these proceedings and should be admissible.
Yes.
Your Honour, dealing with subparagraph A and probative value, the test is whether the evidence can rationally affect the assessment of the probability of the existence of the fact and issue. Here, Your Honours, the fact and issue is whether the respondent's eggs contained caged eggs. And the footage has probative value because it shows the existence of these caged eggs and cage-free eggs. This is particularly important if the respondent's disclaimer on the egg carton is considered to be insufficient. Because of this, Your Honour, the video footage has probative value as well as being important to these proceedings.
Counsel, it seems to me that the respondent's problem with this evidence is the way it's obtained and the fact that the group who obtained it breached the law by not disclosing that evidence to an authority as required by the relevant section in the criminal code. So why didn't the ACCC then just get its own evidence? I don't understand why you didn't carry out your own investigation and get your own evidence that I presume the respondent would have had no problem with.
With respect to Your Honour, the applicant submits that there was no need to waste resources to find any other evidence because this footage captures the existence of the caged eggs and the cage-free eggs, which goes to the fact and issue here. So there's no need to utilise ACCC resources to try and find any other evidence. Your Honours, under subparagraph C of the Evidence Act, the footage should be admitted into evidence because the nature of the cause of action, being misleading or deceptive conduct, is of public interest. Your Honour, misleading or deceptive conduct of this nature is of the public interest. Further, the public outcry and complaints against the respondent since the video footage was aired on national television adds to this public interest.
How so?
It indicates that the public has a great interest in bringing these proceedings against the respondent.
The public has an interest in bringing these proceedings?
Yes, Your Honour.
See, I'm a little bit troubled about how one proves the public outcry and how one becomes cognizant of the public outcry. I see your point, Counsel. I must admit, like my brother Judge here, I was having some difficulty in seeing the connection between the two. But it does seem to me that if you're relying on this concept of public interest, somehow you've got to establish it, haven't you? By evidence.
Yes, Your Honour. And the evidence in this particular proceedings would be that public outcry. But regardless of that misleading and deceptive conduct...
That's not what your written submissions say, Counsel.
No.
Your written submissions say that there's a public interest in misleading or deceptive conduct, not in public outcry.
Yes, Your Honour. The public outcry adds towards that public interest, but misleading and deceptive conduct in itself is still of public interest.
Why?
It's in the public interest to not be misled or deceived in regards to the way a product is being advertised to them.
So every misleading and deceptive conduct claim is going to be in the public interest?
Yes, Your Honour.
Do you have authority for that, Counsel?
No, Your Honour, I have no analogous cases which fit into the particular circumstances of this. Your Honour, the Queen against Daly established that greater weight may be given to evidence in proceedings of greater gravity, and that the gravity was to be assessed by whether there was a public interest in those proceedings. Your Honour, under subparagraph D of the Evidence Act, the footage should be admitted into evidence because the gravity of AAA's impropriety in failing to disclose the footage to a relevant authority was not serious. The Queen against Mary Jansvik in the Victoria Supreme Court of Appeal provided a spectrum to determine the gravity of an impropriety. On the serious end of that spectrum, the two elements were considered on the spectrum. First, that there was knowledge or an understanding of the contravention of the law, and second, that an advantage was obtained that could not have been obtained without the impropriety. Your Honour, on the serious end, it would have both of these, both the knowledge and an advantage being obtained.
I'm not really interested in the question of knowledge, Counsel. It seems to me that there's nothing on the facts that can in any way give us, an understanding of what AAA might have been thinking at the time. Can you refer to this so-called advantage element of subsection D?
Yes, Your Honour. The applicant submits that here, in these circumstances, no advantage was actually obtained. The respondent wishes to put to the court that AAA's advantage was gathering public outcry against the respondent by airing the video footage on national television.
You just said that no advantage was obtained, and then you've just explained what the advantage was.
Your Honour, that's what the respondent wishes to submit. But here in this situation,
made that clear, Counsel.
Yes, Your Honour. Here in this situation, AAA could have supplied the video footage to a media outlet, even if they had complied with section 383.51 of the Criminal Code. And because they were still able to sell that footage to a media outlet, with or without complying with the requirements of the Criminal Code, no advantage was actually obtained in these circumstances. And because of that, the gravity in this situation may be considered to be not serious. Your Honours, under subparagraph E of the Act, the footage should not be admitted into evidence because it was not obtained recklessly. Your Honours, Helmhout described recklessness to require a disregard for the relevant procedures and a conscious decision to proceed regardless of the potential breach. Your Honour, further, Helmhout determined that if there is no repeated occurrences of a breach of procedure, mere failure on one occasion without more information cannot demonstrate recklessness. Here, Your Honours, there's no further information to properly determine whether AAA made a conscious decision, nor is there further evidence that there were repeated occurrences of this breach. And because of this situation should be considered to be an isolated incident, and that this was not a reckless impropriety of the criminal code.
So what was the isolated incident, Counsel? Them not disclosing it to authorities, or them obtaining the evidence?
Them not disclosing to the relevant authority, Your Honour.
Probably should have been made more clear in your written submissions. You said it was not obtained recklessly.
Your Honour, as per section 383.5 3 of the Criminal Code, it states that the evidence is deemed to be obtained improperly for the purposes of section 138(1) of the Evidence Act if it breaches the relevant requirements, which is why in the written submissions we use the word obtained rather than in consequence.
Thanks, Counsel.
Your Honour, the final consideration is subparagraph H, and that the difficulty in obtaining the evidence is an irrelevant consideration of these proceedings.
Sorry, is an irrelevant or relevant consideration?
Is an irrelevant consideration, Your Honour.
How so?
The reason for this, Your Honour, is that subparagraph H takes in consideration whether there was any difficulty in the actual obtainment of the evidence, and the relevant case law in discussing this discusses physical obtainment. Because, Your Honour, in this particular circumstances, that the evidence wasn't obtained improperly due to the obtainment of the evidence, but rather in consequence of section 383.51 of the Criminal Code. And due to that, we distinguish on the relevant case law that in this situation, this subparagraph should not be considered by the court.
It's a pretty skinny argument, Counsel, really, when you look at it. I mean, at best, this question of impropriety attends only upon the failure to disclose, and the footage is disclosed. It's there. That's what you're arguing about, isn't it? The fact that the footage should be admitted into evidence. I would think your stronger argument is the public interest argument. I think everybody could maintain the approach that it's within the interest of the public as to the nature and source of the food which they're consuming.
Your Honour, I see that my time has expired. May I please answer your question?
Yes, of course you may.
Your Honour, the applicant does hold that the public interest is a significant factor in order to determine that the evidence should be admitted. With regards to subparagraph H, though, it does not take into consideration the public interest in determining whether that factor determines whether the evidence should be desirable for admission, which is why we didn't discuss the public interest under that subparagraph.
Right. But you did raise it. You raised it in your submissions, and it's raised with respect to section 138, subparagraph 3C, isn't it?
Yes, Your Honour. Your Honour, if there's no further questions...
No.
Counsel, I have one question. In what circumstances would a cause of action not be in the public interest? You said that in all circumstances misleading deceptive conduct would be. Provide us with an example of a cause of action that would not be in the public interest.
Your Honours, the employment advocate and Williamson within this court held that if it was a victimless offence, then in that circumstance it would not be there would not be a greater public interest for admission of the evidence. Your Honour, no examples coming to mind in terms of a victimless offence, but misleading and deceptive conduct within this circumstance, there's clear evidence that there are people who are being affected by the misleading or deceptive conduct.
I think there's something in the judgment, if I remember, of Chief Justice Gibbs in a case involving the Trade Practices Act, where he says that if there's advertising which is false, misleading and deceptive, but no one's deceived, it's a victimless crime. I think that's probably what council would be alluding to. Yes.
Thanks, Your Honour.
Thank you.
My co-counsel will now address the court for the applicant's second submission. Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes.
Your Honours, turning now to the applicant's second submission, that the applicant in this case has a reasonable prospect of success in establishing that the respondent has engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct under Section 18 of the ACL. This submission has two grounds. First, that the way in which the respondent markets its home brand range eggs is misleading or deceptive, and second, that the failure by the respondent of non-disclosure of products that have been prepared in accordance with religious requirements is misleading or deceptive. I'll begin with the first ground. Misleading or deceptive conduct for the purposes of Section 18 occurs where a reasonable member within an affected class of consumers is likely to form an erroneous belief as to the characteristics of a product. Here, the class of consumer who is likely affected by the conduct of the respondent are those consumers who prefer non-caged eggs and are prepared to make their decision based off an overall impression, not unobtrusive disclaimers. The reasonable consumer in our case is not one who pays astute care and attention to the labeling of products. The applicant's success in establishing that the marketing of these eggs is misleading or deceptive is contingent on the court finding that, first, the representations or the overall impression from the representations by the respondent.
What are the representations, counsel?
In this case, the representations are twofold. First, the packaging and labeling of the carton of eggs seen on page 12, Exhibit 1 of the agreed facts. And second, the pricing of this product that is priced within a similar price range of free-range eggs.
What is that price range, counsel?
Your Honour, the agreed facts do not outline that exact price. However, it's been outlined in the agreed facts that the price is of a similar range to free-range eggs, not caged.
There's not a significant difference between caged and free-range eggs these days anyway, is there?
It's, in regard to eggs, Your Honour, that price range, even if not significant, is still varied depending on the egg production system.
Where does that take you, though?
Your Honour, in considering that price that falls within the same price range as free-range eggs, the court is to consider that representation with the labeling and packaging of the eggs in our case. On page 12, Exhibit 1 of the agreed facts.
Yes, I've got that.
The carton of eggs in our case has a clear representation of a picture of a chicken spending its times outdoors.
Counsel, they're not exactly going to put a chicken in a cage on their egg carton, are they?
Not necessarily, Your Honour. However, the court is to consider the overall impression of this picture representation with the price and the respondent's conduct. And so, although the picture itself would not be misleading or deceiving, it is the consideration of the price in our case, the fact that the central representation is of a chicken outdoors, and that these are the overall impressions by the respondent that are likely to lead consumers into an erroneous belief that the eggs they are purchasing are non-caged.
Yeah, but this is an argument that's very much akin to the one that was run in the Cadbury Schweppes case, where they said that the colour of the packaging of a chocolate bar would mislead or deceive a purchaser into believing it was a product by one company when in fact it was a product by another. You're aware of that case, aren't you?
Yes, Your Honour. In regard to that case, the case was primarily concerned with misleading or deceptive conduct and passing off. And in our case, we're concerned with whether the disclaimer in our case is sufficient to dispel of any misleading or deceptive conduct from the overall impression from the packaging of our eggs.
And I think there was an argument there too, wasn't there, that and there was some expert evidence to the effect that consumers these days are more motivated by things other than words. And the point you're making here seems to be, here's a picture of what appears to be a happy chicken outside, and in fact the packaging discloses that this is not in fact the case, that the eggs are not coming from free-range chickens, they're coming from chickens that are also confined. Is that the argument that you're developing?
That's right, Your Honour. That in regard to
so
this...
you're most reliant on the picture then?
It's the overall impression. The picture adds to that overall impression that a consumer may form as to the characteristics of the eggs. And in regard to that impression, the disclaimer in our case is not sufficient to dispel of that erroneous belief. In cases where disclaimers are an issue, the court is to consider whether or not that disclaimer is sufficiently prominent or proportionate to the fleeting impression to dispel of any misleading or deceptive conduct. In our case, the presence of that disclaimer appears on the bottom of the carton of eggs in small font with no sufficient contrast to that background. And a reasonable consumer in our case, who is shopping for a number of items in the respondent stores, who is basing their decision and who is affected by a likely, by an intuitive sense rather than a logical or analytical choice, is unlikely to notice such a small disclaimer that appears. The font size, Your Honour, no, Your Honour, the font size is in accordance with relevant guidelines. For example, the Australian Egg Corporation outlines that the minimum standard size is 6 millimeters. However, this guideline is simply a guideline for retailers, and the case still falls.
So those guidelines aren't mandated by the relevant legislation or anything of the sort?
No, Your Honour. And the concern here is whether, regardless of that size, if it is sufficient to dispel of that misleading or deceptive conduct. The applicant submits that in comparison to that overall impression that consumers may form, the respondent in this case has not taken sufficient steps for the disclaimer to be noticed by the reasonable consumer in our case. And so the marketing and labeling of this product by the respondent is likely to cause a reasonable consumer to form an erroneous belief that the characteristics of this product are of non-caged eggs. This is misleading or deceptive under Section 18 of the ACL.
So, Counsel, how reliant are you on this so-called price differentiation? I mean, for instance, if these eggs were priced at a lower threshold, equivalent to, say, the standard home brand caged eggs, would you still be bringing this application?
In that case, Your Honour, the overall impression would still be likely to mislead or deceive, because in that case, the disclaimer still appears in the size that is too small and not sufficiently prominent to be noticed by consumers. However, the price is still a relevant consideration.
Okay. We'll move to your next submission, Counsel.
Yes, Your Honours. The second submission for the applicant is that in the case of non-disclosure, misleading or deceptive conduct may arise where, in the circumstances of a case, non-disclosure supports an inference that a fact does not exist. In this case, Your Honour, the class of consumers who we are concerned with are those who are particularly fretful about the products that they purchase or the source of those products. These are consumers who prefer meat that comes from animals that have been stunned prior to slaughter. And in...
Counsel, is it relevant to your application that there are a significant proportion of the population or an insignificant portion of the population that does in fact care about the way in which their meat is slaughtered?
Your Honours, in regard to significant portion of consumers to be misled or deceived, the question is not whether the likely affected class is insignificant, but rather whether the reasonable members within that affected class and whether there is an insignificant number within the class who would have been misled or deceived.
So isn't it open to the respondent to argue that the relevant class is only that very small group of people who have actually noticed the difference in labelling on that particular product in the city as opposed to the regional areas?
That's true, Your Honour. However, the applicant submits that this class of consumers is not, or the significance or size of this consumer, class of consumers, is not a relevant or
so is that an implicit concession that that's the size of that section of the community is very small?
Your Honour, it is difficult to assess how many consumers would have noticed that difference or how many consumers shop at different stores. But there are likely to be consumers who do make their, do conduct their shopping at the respondent stores in different cities, depending on where they are that day or during that week. And because a significant number of the Australian population is in fact concerned of the way in which animals are slaughtered prior to slaughter, then this consideration or this class is to be considered. Your Honours, I see that my time is, has almost expired. May I briefly summarize the second submission for the applicant?
Yes, thank you.
The applicant submits that because of the respondent's acts and omissions, that is, to label these products in the most populated areas of Australia, then the respondent by these acts has caused circumstances in which the silence of non-halal or kosher supports the inference that that product comes from an animal that has been stunned prior to slaughter. And thus, consumers are likely to form an erroneous belief when purchasing products without a label that that product comes from an animal that was stunned. This conduct is misleading or deceptive under Section 18 of the ACL. Your Honours, I see that my time has expired. If I may draw your attention to the applicant's final page of our written submissions.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Paskovitz.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Your Honours.